It was on a golden afternoon in early September that the peace of Street Mildred's parish was so unexpectedly disturbed. The church fete had begun with its usual charm. Tables laden with jams, embroidered linens, and sponge cakes lined the green. The brass band from Chipping Cleeve played Colonel Bogey with too much enthusiasm, and the Reverend Pottle, perspiring under his straw hat, circulated among his flock with the air of a man who had successfully avoided sermonizing for one blessed day. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the shade of a chestnut tree, knitting a pair of socks destined, she said, for the missionary box, though no one doubted they would eventually find their way to the curate instead. She had just begun a row of rather complex ribbing when she noticed the boy. He was standing quite still at the edge of the green, a thin, pale creature in a worn coat, 2 sizes too large for him, the hem brushing against his ankles. His face was sharp and oddly expressionless, as if he were waiting for something that might never arrive. Nobody seemed to know him. He had no basket for the raffle, no family to speak of nearby, and no one called him by name. Yet there was something about his stillness, a kind of watchful quiet, that caught Miss Marple's eye at once. She watched as he moved toward the cake stall, not greedily, but as if measuring the distance between himself and the people gathered there. When Mrs. Bantry asked his name, the boy only looked away, his lips parting slightly, as though the question had startled him. Then he turned and vanished into the line of trees behind the vicarage. It was an hour later when the scream came. A woman's voice, Mrs. Bantry's again, shrill, terrified, and cutting straight through the brass band's cheerful din. The fete froze in an instant. People dropped cups of lemonade and plates of scones as heads turned toward the vicarage path. Miss Marple, who had already risen before anyone else thought to move, laid down her knitting, folded her shawl neatly over the back of the bench, and walked, not ran, toward the sound. Behind the rose trellis, on the narrow gravel path leading to the vestry door, lay the still body of a man. His clothes marked him as a visitor, fine cloth, London tailoring, a faint scent of cologne that did not belong to country air. But what unsettled everyone most was the absence of identification. No wallet, no papers, no hat, not even a monogrammed handkerchief. He, like the boy, carried no name. By the time Inspector Cray arrived from Melchester, the crowd had grown into a dense, murmuring circle. Whispers flew faster than the wind across the green. "A stranger," said one. "A debt," murmured another. "Or jealousy, you know how that sort of thing festers." Miss Marple listened, eyes half closed, hands folded primly. She knew the village well enough to recognize that in a place like Street Mildred's, murder, when it came, never arrived as an outsider. It came wearing a familiar smile, a borrowed coat, a remembered kindness. The inspector was brisk, red-faced, and faintly irritated to find Miss Marple already on the scene. "Now then, Miss Marple," he said, attempting cheerfulness. "Best to leave this to the proper authorities, eh?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, of course, Inspector," she said. "Only I was thinking. It's a pity about that little boy." "Boy?" He frowned. "Yes," she replied softly, "the one no one seems to know." Her eyes wandered toward the shadowed trees where the boy had disappeared, and for a brief moment her expression was unreadable. Not pity, not curiosity, but the quiet certainty of someone who had already seen too much of what people tried to hide. By evening, the fate had long since dispersed, though a nervous sort of energy still lingered about the green. The bunting fluttered weakly in the fading light, and the stalls, now half dismantled, stood like the ghosts of a happier day. Near the vicarage gate, Inspector Cray's men moved with deliberate care, marking the ground and photographing the path where the stranger had fallen. The villagers, however, were not so disciplined. They stood in small, murmuring knots, eager to exchange speculation disguised as sympathy. Miss Marple had heard every tone of that particular kind of talk before the shiver of excitement, poorly veiled by moral concern, the relish of gossip, hiding behind expressions of sorrow. She herself said very little, though her eyes missed nothing. The boy had not returned. A child so young, with no name and nowhere to go, should have been frightened into running to the nearest warm kitchen or constable. But he hadn't, and that meant, in Miss Marple's experience, one of two things. Either he was too frightened of being found, or he had reason to believe he would not be looked for. She mentioned as much to the Reverend Pottle when he passed by, pale and distracted, wringing his hands about the scandal that would surely follow. "Oh, dear me, Miss Marple," he said, "I can't think what's to be done. Murder, and on parish grounds of all places. And this poor boy, perhaps some beggar's child, or an orphan from the workhouse." "I rather think not," Miss Marple said gently. His shoes were too well made, though badly worn, and the hem of his coat stitched by hand, yes, but with skill. Someone once cared for him very much, I should say. The vicar blinked, uncertain whether to find comfort or distress in her observation. "You don't suppose he had anything to do with it?" Miss Marple smiled in that quiet way of hers that made people feel both reassured and faintly foolish. "We mustn't suppose anything just yet, Reverend. But I do think the two mysteries, the boy and the stranger, will prove less separate than they appear." Inspector Cray, overhearing the remark, frowned as he approached. He was not a cruel man, merely practical and rather proud of his title. "Now, Miss Marple," he began with forced patience, "you've seen many a thing in your time, I'll grant you that. But this isn't one of your village disputes. We've a proper investigation underway. The doctor says the man was struck from behind with a blunt object, something heavy and rounded, perhaps a stone ornament. There was no struggle." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "No struggle suggests he trusted whoever was near him," she said. "Or perhaps he never saw the blow coming." Cray sighed. "You'll have me chasing phantoms if I'm not careful. The only thing we're chasing now is that boy you mentioned. Several people saw him loitering about before the fete began. Might have been after a few coins or a bite to eat." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice mild, though he didn't look hungry in the ordinary sense. "Meaning what exactly?" Cray asked. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly over her handbag. "Some people are hungry for food, Inspector. Others for safety." That night, Street, Mildred's fell under a hush broken only by the ticking of clocks and the occasional creak of old timbers settling in the cool. Curtains were drawn early, doors bolted twice, and lamps burned longer than usual. Miss Marple, however, sat by her window overlooking the vicarage garden. She had seen the constables remove the body, seen the path washed down, and still she could not sleep. Somewhere beyond the hedge, an owl called softly. Then a faint rustling, not the scurry of a hedgehog nor the flap of wings, but something slower, human. She rose, pulled a shawl around her shoulders, and peered out. The moonlight caught the outline of movement near the vicarage wall, a small figure crouched by the hydrangeas. The boy. She opened her window a fraction, careful not to startle him. "You needn't hide," she said softly. "No one's going to hurt you here." For a moment, he froze, his face half lit by the moon. Then he turned and bolted into the shadows. Miss Marple sighed and sat back down. The poor child would not get far. The countryside at night had a way of closing in on those who didn't belong. Still, she made a mental note to tell Inspector Cray in the morning, though she suspected he'd already have his hands full with other matters. Indeed, by morning, the whole village seemed to have grown a new vocabulary of scandal. At the grocer's, Mrs. Bantry was heard declaring that she'd seen the dead man before, though I can't quite recall where. At the post office, old Mr. Finch claimed he'd noticed a motor car parked near the rectory gate the previous evening. A fine one, black, with a London plate. And at breakfast, Miss Marple's maid confided that Constable Owens had spent half the night searching the woods with lanterns and dogs, but found nothing but a torn scrap of fabric near the brook. By the time Inspector Cray called upon Miss Marple at mid-morning, his temper had frayed at the edges. "I don't know how you put up with them," he said irritably as she poured him tea. "Half the village has decided the man was some secret lover of Mrs. Bantry's cousin, and the other half thinks he was a foreign spy. I've spent my morning sifting fairy tales from nonsense. Miss Marple stirred her tea, untroubled. Well, you know, Inspector, fairy tales often contain a grain of truth. It only takes knowing where to look. Cray grunted. If you mean that boy again, we've no sign of him. My men searched every outhouse and barn between here and the railway road. Did they look in the vicarage loft? Miss Marple asked gently. Cray blinked. The loft? It's quite large, she said, and seldom locked. I remember Mrs. Pottle once saying it was full of old parish records and moth-eaten choir robes. It would make a fine hiding place for a frightened child. There was a long pause. Then Cray set down his cup. You've a way of making a man feel foolish, Miss Marple. Oh, not at all, she said kindly. I merely notice things. An hour later, the vicarage loft yielded its secret. Among the dust and broken hymnals, curled beneath a tattered altar cloth, lay the boy exhausted, pale, and trembling, but alive. In his hand, he clutched something tightly, refusing to let it go, until Miss Marple herself knelt beside him and coaxed it free. A small brass locket, tarnished but finely made. Inside was a photograph of the dead man. The boy began to cry, silent tears streaking the dirt on his cheeks. Miss Marple touched his shoulder gently. There, now, she murmured. No need to speak just yet. You've told us enough already. Outside, the church bells tolled the hour, each chime rolling over the village like a reminder. Even in the gentlest of places, darkness waits only for the right afternoon to reveal itself. Inspector Cray stood at the foot of the vicarage stairs, his notebook open and his pencil poised, though he wrote nothing for a long moment. The boy sat in the drawing room, wrapped in a blanket, his bare feet tucked beneath him and his eyes fixed on the small brass locket that lay on the table. He had not spoken a word since being found, though Miss Marple had offered him milk and toast and every kind of gentle coaxing known to kindly English ladies. His silence was not defiance. It was the kind that came from fear so deep it had learned to live quietly. The inspector cleared his throat. We'll need his name eventually, he said gruffly. We can't keep calling him the boy. Miss Marple, seated opposite, continued her knitting. Names will come in time, she said softly, when one feels safe enough to use them. Cray frowned, tapping his pencil. He's hiding something. That locket, well, it ties him to the victim. Could be his father. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. Or someone he wished was, she murmured. Cray looked up. You think he's not the son? I think, she replied, that children often carry attachments that are not quite what they seem. She nodded toward the locket. That picture is not worn from handling. It's new, perhaps recently placed there. And the clasp is slightly bent, as if pried open and shut again by small hands in haste. Cray sighed, frustrated but not dismissive. You see more in a trinket than most see in a confession. Outside, the morning sun struggled through thin clouds, and the village, though quieter than usual, could not resist its old habits. Mrs. Bantry had already sent her maid to fetch eggs from the dairy and to casually inquire if the police had made any arrests. The grocer's boy had delivered twice as many orders as usual, lingering at each doorstep for gossip disguised as service. By noon, half of street, Mildred's was convinced the child was an accomplice, the other half that he was an orphaned heir to some London fortune. Miss Marple heard both theories within an hour of leaving the vicarage, but she neither confirmed nor denied them. Her attention, as always, it was on smaller things, the way the baker's wife kept glancing at the post road, the curious fact that the station master had been unusually short with customers that morning, and the subtle but telling absence of Mr. Lionel Grant, the local solicitor who never missed a chance to be seen in the vicar's company. By afternoon, Inspector Cray returned to the green with a new lead. The dead man's jacket, when properly examined, had yielded a faint laundry mark HT47 traced to a tailor's shop in London, just off Kensington Road. The tailor recalled the suit, made 6 months earlier for a Mr. Henry Talbot, no occupation listed, but the bill had been paid in cash by a woman. Cray relayed this information to Miss Marple while she arranged tea for 2 at her small sitting room. "Talbot," she repeated thoughtfully. "It has a city sound to it. A man of means, perhaps, or at least of appearance. And the woman who paid no name? None given," Cray replied. "The tailor said she was refined. Mid-30s, soft-spoken, a wedding band on her finger." Miss Marple poured the tea, her expression serene. "People who hide their names seldom hide their intentions as well as they think," she said. "If a woman paid for that suit and the man came here soon after, there's a reason. Either she wanted him gone from her world, or he came to end something in hers." Cray sipped his tea, half smiling despite himself. "You'd make a fair detective, Miss Marple." She looked mildly offended. "I should hope not. Detectives, I imagine, must be quite accustomed to being lied to. I prefer to be told the truth, even if people don't know they're saying it." A light knock interrupted them. It was Constable Owens, looking pale. "Sir," he said, "we've found something by the brook, near the footbridge. Looks like a letter." Cray stood, motioning for Owens to hand it over. The envelope was damp but still legible, its edges smeared with mud. The handwriting inside was elegant, almost theatrical. "My dearest H, do not come here. You will ruin us both." There was no signature, only a faint scent of lavender clinging to the paper. Miss Marple leaned forward, inhaling lightly. "Lavender water," she said, "from Winton's pharmacy in Melchester. Only 2 ladies in the village buy it regularly, Mrs. Bantry and Mrs. Pottle." Cray stared. "The vicar's wife?" Miss Marple's voice softened, as if the thought pained her. "I don't think she's capable of murder, Inspector. But secrecy? Yes. Especially if the Reverend's reputation stood to suffer." She gazed out the window toward the church spire, its shadow, stretching long across the lane. "I dare say the boy knows which of those ladies wrote that letter, though he may not yet understand what it means." That evening, Miss Marple walked home from evensong with deliberate slowness. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp leaves, and every cottage window glowed with the soft amber of kerosene lamps. But she could not shake the image of the boy's frightened eyes, or the polished locket glinting on the table. It was, she knew, the kind of puzzle whose answer hid not in alibis or fingerprints but in affection, misplaced in the small, human mistakes that lead otherwise decent souls toward tragedy. When she reached her gate, she paused. A figure was waiting by her rosebush, small, thin, and shivering. The boy. His eyes were red from crying, and in his hand he held a folded scrap of paper. "I didn't mean to," he whispered before she could speak. "He was my friend." Miss Marple led him inside without a word, seating him near the fire. Only when his breathing steadied did she open the paper. It was another note, crumpled and half-torn, written in the same hand as the one by the brook. "Wait by the church after dusk. I'll explain everything." The boy began to tremble again. "He said she wanted to help me, that she'd tell me who I was. But then someone else came." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "Someone else, dear?" He nodded, tears streaking his cheeks. "A man!" he shouted at her. I ran. Then I heard the noise. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Miss Marple folded the note carefully and set it beside the first. "You've done very well," she said softly. "And now, I think, we must find the truth of what frightened 2 people enough to hide behind letters and lies." For the first time, the boy lifted his eyes to meet hers. "Will they believe me?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "They will," she said, "because people always believe the truth, just never at the right moment." Miss Marple did not sleep that night. The boy's confession, if it could be called that, lingered in her mind like the faint scent of lavender that had clung to the letter. She sat by the fire long after he had drifted into a fitful sleep on her sofa, watching the embers shift and settle. There was something profoundly sorrowful about it all. A man who had no name, a boy who had too many secrets, and a village that was far too eager to make sense of a thing that had none. When the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, she rose quietly, covered the boy with a blanket, and went out into the garden. Morning dew clung to the roses, and the air was cool enough to make her breath visible. She needed to think, and Miss Marple did her best thinking among her flowers. By 8 o'clock, Inspector Cray was at her door, looking more weary than triumphant. "We've traced the handwriting," he said without preamble. "The letter found by the brook, it's a match to Mrs. Pottle's. She admits writing it, but claims it was only to stop the man from bothering her. Says he'd been following her, threatening to tell her husband some nonsense about a past indiscretion." Miss Marple tilted her head, eyes calm but alert. "And does the Reverend believe her?" Cray hesitated. "He's shaken, of course. Says he's known her 20 years and won't hear a word against her. Still, there's the letter, and the timing fits. The man arrived the night before the fete. The Reverend claims he was in the vestry that afternoon, alone, preparing sermon notes. No one can confirm it." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea, unruffled. "You're thinking the Reverend struck the man down?" "I'm thinking," Cray said heavily, "that every decent person in this village seems to have a piece of the truth, but won't part with it." He rubbed his brow. "And that boy of yours, what's his story?" Miss Marple's gaze softened. "He said the woman wanted to help him, that she promised to tell him who he was, but someone else came before she could. I rather think that someone was our victim." Cray frowned. "So the boy came here on purpose, looking for her?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "He must have been sent. Children rarely travel alone without instruction." She set down her cup and folded her hands neatly in her lap. "I believe Mr. Henry Talbot, if that was indeed his name, was not only connected to the boy, but to Mrs. Pottle herself." Cray looked up sharply. "You mean—" "I mean," she interrupted gently, "that people often mistake kindness for concealment. Mrs. Pottle may have written that letter not out of fear for her reputation, but to protect someone else's." At that moment, a soft sound broke through their conversation, the creak of a floorboard from the next room. The boy was awake, pale and thin in the doorway, holding the brass locket again. "It wasn't her," he said in a trembling voice. "She didn't hurt him. He just wanted her to tell me." Cray crouched slightly. "Tell you what, son?" The boy swallowed hard. "That she was my mother." The words hung in the air like a bell's last note. Even Cray seemed at a loss, his mouth half open, his pencil frozen above the page. Miss Marple's expression, however, did not change. Only her knitting paused, the yarn stretched taut between her fingers. "And did she?" she asked softly. The boy shook his head. "She cried. She said it wasn't true, that it was a lie. But he said she'd have to tell the truth, that everyone would know soon." Then someone shouted. I ran before I saw who it was. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did you hear the voice, dear? Could you tell if it was a man's or a woman's?" "A man's," he whispered. "But not the one who died." Cray stood, pacing. "That complicates things nicely," he muttered. "So now we've 3 people by the vicarage that afternoon. The Reverend, his wife, and a man we can't name, and our dead Londoner trying to force a confession out of a woman claiming she isn't his child's mother." Miss Marple rose and crossed to the window, looking out toward the churchyard. "The Reverend said he was alone in the vestry," she murmured. "But there are 2 paths leading there, one from the garden, one from the back gate. A quarrel could have happened within yards of where the fete music was playing, and no one would have heard a thing." She turned back to Cray. "You must ask the Reverend again where he was when the music stopped." Cray stared at her. "You think the Reverend did it?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that the Reverend is a man of faith. but not necessarily of courage. If his wife's past threatened his position, he might have found righteousness an easy mask for fear. Cray left soon after, promising to question the Pottles again. Miss Marple watched from her window as he crossed the lane, his shoulders squared with purpose but his expression clouded with unease. When she turned back, the boy was still seated by the fire, staring into the flames. "It's all right," she said gently. "Whatever happened, we'll find the truth." He looked up at her, eyes wide. "Will they send me away?" "Perhaps for a little while," she said honestly. "But not forever. You've done something very brave, you know. Telling the truth always is." The boy nodded faintly, then held out the locket once more. "He gave this to me before he went to see her. Said it would help me remember." Miss Marple opened it again, studying the photograph. Behind the man's face was a faint smudge, not dirt, but something else. She tilted it to the light and saw, beneath the image, the trace of another picture that had been replaced. "Interesting," she murmured. "Someone removed the original photograph, but not carefully enough." "What does it mean?" the boy asked. "That," Miss Marple said with quiet certainty, "depends on who wanted you to forget." Outside, the church bell struck 9, its echo soft and deliberate across the sleeping fields. In that moment, Miss Marple knew the investigation was turning not toward evidence or alibi, but toward motive. And in villages like Street Mildred's, motives were rarely born of greed or hatred. They were born of love, the dangerous kind that dressed itself in silence and good intentions. The morning after brought a stillness to Street Mildred's that felt unnatural, like a breath held too long. A drizzle misted over the churchyard, softening the outlines of gravestones and turning the path into a ribbon of damp earth. Miss Marple watched from her window as Inspector Cray crossed the lane once again, his boots dark with mud and his expression grimmer than usual. She opened the door before he could knock, as though she had been expecting him all along. "You've been to the vicarage," she said quietly. "And things did not go well." He sighed, removing his hat. "You've the devil's own intuition, Miss Marple. The Reverend insists he never left the vestry, but a gardener swears he saw him by the hedge near the path just before the scream. I pressed him, and he near fainted from guilt. Says he only went to calm his wife after the stranger threatened her, but well, I've heard that before." Miss Marple motioned for him to sit, the kettle already whistling behind her. "Did Mrs. Pottle confirm his account?" "She did," Cray said. "Word for word. Too neat by half. She's clinging to her story like a hymn book in a storm." He rubbed his temples. "The trouble is, nothing adds up. The boy's tale, the letters, the missing photograph, it's all smoke. And yet, it feels close, like the answer's there, just behind the curtain." Miss Marple handed him tea. "It usually is," she said mildly. "But curtains, Inspector, are only drawn when someone fears the view beyond them." Before he could reply, there came a light knock at the door. It was Mrs. Bantry, breathless from her walk up the lane and brimming with suppressed excitement. "Oh, Miss Marple, you won't believe what I've found. The boy, well, something belonging to him, I think." She produced a small envelope, slightly torn and stained with water. Inside was a folded page of fine stationery, embossed with the initials H.T. and a few blurred lines of handwriting. "If you mean to deny him, then let the world know it was I who loved him first." Cray straightened at once. "Where did you find this?" "In the churchyard," Mrs. Bantry said. "Under the old yew by the west wall. My dog was scratching at it. Buried. Not quite. More as if it had been dropped in a hurry." When she had gone, Miss Marple laid the note flat upon the table. The ink was faintly smudged, but the shape of the writing was unmistakable, bold, deliberate, the same as in the letters to Mrs. Pottle. "Our Mr. Talbot again," she murmured. "Though this sounds less like blackmail than heartbreak." Cray frowned. "You think they were lovers?" "I think," she said slowly, that love takes many forms. Sometimes devotion becomes desperation, and desperation, well, it often ends in tragedy. She looked thoughtfully toward the hearth, where the boy's small jacket still hung drying. The key is that word, deny. He meant the child, of course. Cray's pencil stilled above his notebook, so the Reverend knew the boy wasn't his, and when the truth threatened to come out, Miss Marple interrupted softly. Let us not be too quick to condemn a man before he's been given the dignity of lying to us himself. She smiled faintly. Men of faith are often poor liars, Inspector. The truth, if pressed, leaks through their conscience like ink through tissue. They went together to the vicarage that afternoon. The Reverend met them in his study, his eyes red-rimmed, his voice trembling slightly as he welcomed them. Mrs. Pottle was not there. She's resting, he said quickly when Miss Marple inquired. This whole affair has been a terrible strain on her nerves. Miss Marple's gaze wandered across the room, pausing on a small framed photograph upon the desk, a woman holding a baby, the edges of the picture slightly burned, as if once discarded. A lovely photograph, she said gently. Your wife looks younger there. And the child, was he a parish orphan? The Reverend hesitated too long. Yes, one we cared for a short while, he said. But he died, poor thing. Fever, I believe. I see, Miss Marple said. Her tone was kind, but her eyes were unyielding. Strange, isn't it, how certain faces echo through time? This little boy we found, he might almost be that same child grown a few years older. The Reverend's hands tightened upon the desk. That's impossible, he whispered. Cray stepped forward. Reverend Pottle, you know more than you've said. That photograph, why is it burned? And why was the stranger threatening your wife about the boy? The clergyman's composure broke. He sank into his chair, voice low and ragged. Because it was true, he said. The boy James is hers, not mine. She bore him years before we were wed. Talbot was the father. She told me he died abroad, and I believed her. Then last week he wrote, demanding she acknowledge the child. She begged me to forgive her, to protect her from scandal. I went to meet him by the vestry path. We argued. He said he'd take the boy, that he'd expose us both. I pushed him away, and he fell. I swear I didn't mean for it to happen. The silence that followed was long and terrible. Cray's pencil dropped from his fingers. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, as though in prayer. And your wife? She asked softly. She knew nothing, he said hoarsely. When she found me beside the body, she helped me carry him to the hedge. We thought. Perhaps no one would know. Miss Marple rose quietly, the gentleness in her manner almost unbearable. Someone always knows, Reverend, even when they cannot speak of it. She looked toward the door where, unseen, the boys stood clutching the frame of the doorway, especially children. Cray moved to escort the Reverend away, but Miss Marple raised a hand. Let him say goodbye, she murmured. The man looked up at the boy, face crumpling with grief. I'm sorry, he whispered. The child did not answer. He simply laid the locket on the desk beside the photograph, the chain glinting faintly in the dull afternoon light. When they left the vicarage, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. Cray said nothing for a long while, then finally murmured, You were right, Miss Marple. It wasn't greed or malice that killed him. No, she said quietly, just love that lost its way. And as they walked back toward the village green, Miss Marple's eyes drifted once more to the church spire, rising pale against the sky, a reminder that even in the most peaceful of parishes, sin had a way of kneeling politely before it was found out. The confession had quieted the village for a day, but not its doubts. Rumor, in Street Mildred's, was like ivy trim one branch, and it crept back from another direction. The Reverend's arrest was whispered about with pity by some, satisfaction by others. Only Miss Marple seemed unswayed by the surface neatness of the case. Something in the Reverend's trembling words had not rung true to her. Not the guilt itself, but the timing of it. She had seen enough broken souls to know when a man was burdened by sin and when he merely carried someone else's. That evening, she took a slow walk past the vicarage. The curtains were drawn, the lamps dimmed. From inside came the faint sound of a woman's sobs, Mrs. Pottle's. Miss Marple paused, the gravel soft underfoot, and watched the smoke curl faintly from the chimney. The smell was peculiar, not coal, but burning paper. By morning, she had made up her mind. Inspector Cray arrived just after breakfast. "They've moved him to Melchester Gaol," he said, setting his hat on the table. Signed the statement, "though I'll admit, it's thin as broth. The magistrate will want more than remorse." Miss Marple poured him tea, her eyes never leaving the steam. "Tell me," she said, "did Mrs. Pottle weep much when her husband was taken?" Cray blinked. "Quite the performance, by all accounts." "Ah," she murmured. "That sort of weeping often means there is something left to protect." Cray stared. "You think she's involved? I think she's not as fragile as she appears. Women who've lived with guilt learn to cry with great conviction." She suggested they pay her a call, merely to offer sympathy. Mrs. Pottle received them in the sitting room, her eyes swollen, a handkerchief twisting between her fingers. "I can hardly bear it," she whispered. "He was only trying to spare me humiliation." Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the hearth. The ashes were grey, but a few unburned fragments of paper remained. She leaned forward delicately. "How dreadful this must be for you, my dear. And such a mess for poor Cray's men, all that dreadful rain." Mrs. Pottle nodded, distracted, and Miss Marple's eyes caught a faint glimmer among the ashes melted sealing wax, deep purple, the colour used on the vicarage's own correspondence. Later, outside, she said quietly, "He burned his sermon drafts, perhaps? Or she burned something else." Cray frowned. "The letter? No, something more personal. Letters are for deceiving others. Diaries are for deceiving oneself." That afternoon, Miss Marple sent her maid with a basket of scones to the Pottles' house. While the maid waited in the kitchen, Miss Marple herself called at the church, where the sexton, Mr. Harper, was polishing the brass lectern. "A terrible affair," he said, shaking his head. "And to think the Reverend always so punctual about locking up, except that day, of course." "Oh," she prompted gently. "Left the key hanging in the vestry door," Harper said. "Mrs. Pottle sent me for it later, said she'd need to arrange flowers in the morning. But when I went, it wasn't there." "And who had it, do you know?" He scratched his head. "Found it next day in the collection box. Odd place for a key." When Miss Marple returned home, the boy was waiting in the garden, the locket again clutched tight. "They say he killed him," he said, voice small. "But he didn't." "And how do you know that, dear?" "Because I saw her," he whispered. "After I ran, I came back. She was standing by the man. There was blood on her sleeve. She wiped it with her scarf and dropped it in the brook." His eyes filled, but he did not look away. She looked scared, not like someone who meant to hurt him, but she wasn't crying then. Miss Marple stroked his shoulder gently. "You've been very brave," she said. "Now we must let the truth speak for itself." She sent a note to Inspector Cray, brief and precise. "Come to the brook at dusk. Bring Mrs. Pottle quietly." The evening was damp and pale, the air heavy with the smell of moss. Mrs. Pottle arrived between two constables, her hands trembling more from fear than cold. Miss Marple stood by the edge of the water, where reeds bent in the current. "You dropped something here," she said simply. The woman's lips parted, then closed again. Cray gestured, and one of his men moved into the reeds. After a few moments he returned, holding a sodden scrap of silk lavender in color, embroidered faintly with the initials M.P. and darkened by a rust-brown stain. Mrs. Pottle made a sound that was not quite a cry. "He wouldn't stop," she said suddenly, the words spilling out. "He said he'd ruin us both. Take the boy away." I begged him to leave. He laughed. I only meant to frighten him, to push him aside, and he fell. I didn't know. I didn't know there was a stone there. She sank to her knees, sobbing. My husband tried to take the blame. He said God would forgive him if it spared me. But God cannot forgive a lie. The constables helped her to her feet. Cray looked to Miss Marple, his expression a mixture of weariness and awe. "You had this figured, didn't you?" "Not figured," she replied softly, "only felt. There is a particular silence that comes when guilt lives under the same roof as love." The Reverend's silence was the wrong kind, protective, not remorseful. They led Mrs. Pottle away, her steps unsteady, her face pale against the darkening water. The boy watched from the lane, eyes wide and hollow, but Miss Marple went to him and took his hand. "It's over now," she said. "No one can take away who you are. Not anymore." Later, as the lamps were lit in the cottages and the bells tolled softly for evening prayer, Inspector Cray lingered at Miss Marple's gate. "Do you ever tire of being right, ma'am?" he asked with a weary smile. She gave a little laugh. "Oh, my dear Inspector, I'm never right. People simply reveal themselves, in time. I just happen to be looking when they do." And as she turned toward her quiet house, where the kettle would soon whistle and the knitting lay waiting by the fire, she thought again of that lost boy, of the woman's trembling voice, and of the faint scent of lavender that seemed to linger in the night air, the perfume of secrets, and of mercy too late to save anyone at all. The days that followed were hushed, as if the village itself was holding its breath. The news spread. Of course it always did, but quietly, without the usual relish. There was pity in the telling this time. Pity for the boy, for the Reverend who had given up his freedom to shield a wife who could not bear her own past, and perhaps even for Mrs. Pottle herself, who sat now in Melchester Gaol with her hands folded as though still in prayer. Miss Marple received a letter from Inspector Cray 3 mornings later. It was short, courteous, and written in his heavy hand. Case concluded. The inquest accepts accidental death. The Reverend has been released. The boy will be placed in care. Miss Marple read the words twice before setting them down beside her tea. Something about them felt unfinished. Not wrong exactly, but incomplete, like a painting signed too early. The Reverend, she knew, would resume his duties once decorum allowed. The parish, in time, would forgive what it preferred to forget. Yet the boy, now unnamed once again, would vanish quietly into the machinery of pity. That, she decided, could not be allowed. By afternoon she had walked to the vicarage, where the garden had gone untended and the curtains hung half-drawn. The Reverend met her at the door, thinner and older than before, his hands trembling as he took her coat. "I owe you more than I can say, Miss Marple," he murmured. "If not for you, I would still be deceiving myself and others." She smiled faintly. "Truth has a habit of waiting for the right listener, Reverend. But tell me, what will become of the boy?" He hesitated. "The magistrate insists he must go to Melchester until arrangements are made. There is talk of a distant cousin, though I fear it is only talk." Miss Marple studied his face for a moment, then said quietly, "Perhaps there is another way. The child needs a home, not a sentence." He looked startled. "You mean, here in street, Mildred's? But after what has happened—" "After what has happened," she interrupted gently, "there is no kinder place on earth. Scandal fades faster than kindness, I find. And if you wish to heal, Reverend, there's no better way than through forgiveness you can touch." He said nothing, but his eyes filled as he turned toward the window where the garden lay under a soft drizzle. "I will speak to the authorities," he whispered. When Miss Marple left the vicarage, she found the boy waiting on the path. He had been staying at the inn under constable's watch, but had slipped away, as children somehow always did. His coat was too large again, and his shoes wet through. "They said I can't stay here," he said, voice flat. They said, "It's not proper." "Proper," Miss Marple said, taking his hand, "is a word grown-ups use when they've forgotten how to be kind." She led him down the lane, their steps soft in the damp gravel. "You've seen more sorrow than most grown men, my dear. But sorrow doesn't mean one must stop belonging somewhere." They passed the green, where the fete tables had long been cleared, leaving only pale patches on the grass where laughter once stood. The world looked ordinary again, which Miss Marple knew was how the world liked to disguise its healing. That evening, Inspector Cray called unexpectedly. He found her in the garden, pruning roses beneath the fading light. "I thought I'd let you know personally," he said. "The woman won't stand trial. The court accepted your statement and the reverend's. The boy's to be placed with the church's guardianship for now." Miss Marple set down her shears. "That won't do," she said simply. Cray blinked. "Beg pardon?" "She belongs to the church," Miss Marple said, "and the church belongs to him as much as to anyone. He's the truest link between them, all the past and the future both." He looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "You know, they'll call it interference." "They usually do," she said mildly. "But they call most kindnesses by the wrong name first." Cray hesitated, then tipped his hat. "I'll see what can be done." He paused at the gate. "You do realize, Miss Marple, that you've made half my reports look redundant?" She smiled. "A little redundancy is good for the soul, Inspector." When he was gone, the village fell back into its small, comfortable rhythm. The baker reopened his shop. The postmistress found new gossip to discuss. And the green filled again with laughter. Yet every evening, Miss Marple saw the boy sitting on the church wall, looking toward the vicarage. One dusk, as bells rang for Compline, she joined him. "Do you miss her?" she asked gently. He nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "She said she'd come back when the flowers grew again." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Then we'll make sure they do." Spring came late that year, but when it did, the vicarage garden bloomed with quiet defiance. The Reverend worked there daily, sleeves rolled, the boy beside him. Sometimes, Miss Marple would watch from her window as they moved together among the beds, turning the earth that had witnessed so much grief. The roses came first, small, stubborn things, pink as dawn. Then the lilies, white and tall as forgiveness itself. On a Sunday not long after, the church filled again, not with curiosity this time, but with something gentler. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, listening as the Reverend spoke. His voice, though frail, carried warmth instead of weariness. "We are none of us without fault," he said, "but even in error, there can be grace if we choose to see it." And when he paused, his eyes found the boys, seated quietly near the front. For a moment, the village seemed to breathe again. After the service, Miss Marple lingered by the door as people passed, murmuring kind things they half meant. Cray approached her, smiling faintly. "You were right again," he said. "They've allowed the boy to stay under the Reverend's care. No institution, after all." Miss Marple looked toward the green, where sunlight was catching the last drops of rain on the leaves. "I told you, Inspector," she said gently. "People always believe the truth, just never at the right moment." He laughed quietly. "You've a way of making murder sound almost merciful." "Oh, not murder," she said. "Only life and its untidy edges." As she walked home, the village bells began again, bright and unhurried, the sound mingling with children's laughter from the green. For the first time since that dreadful afternoon, Street Mildred's felt whole again, and Miss Marple, with her knitting basket on her arm, thought not of crime or confession, but of the strange, enduring kindness that sometimes blooms in the shadow of sorrow, quiet, persistent, and utterly human. A week later, life in Street Mildred's had regained its rhythm, though beneath the calm there remained an unease too delicate to name. The Reverend had resumed his services, his sermons gentler now, more human. The boy sat in the front pew each Sunday, clean and solemn, as though he feared to breathe too loudly in the sacred hush. Miss Marple had watched this new arrangement with quiet satisfaction, yet something continued to tug at the edges of her mind, faint but persistent, like a forgotten note in a melody. It was the feeling she always distrusted most, that everything had settled too neatly. That afternoon, she was pruning the borders when Inspector Cray appeared at her gate again. He had come not in his usual brisk manner, but slow, thoughtful. His coat unbuttoned against the mild wind. "I shouldn't keep troubling you," he said, "but something's turned up in Melchester. The constables there found another letter in Mrs. Pottle's belongings, one she'd hidden inside a hymnal, addressed to the boy." He unfolded a page, careful not to tear the brittle fold. "Forgive me," it read, "for not being brave. The truth was never meant to live this long." Miss Marple frowned. "The truth," she said softly, "rarely writes its own ending." Cray lowered his voice. "There's more. The coroner's report came back from London. That head wound on Talbot, it wasn't a single fall. There were 2 blows, one before the stone, one after. Blunt instrument, flat edge, clean strike." He hesitated. "That wasn't panic, Miss Marple. That was certainty." She set down her secateurs. "Then someone joined her after he fell. Someone who wished to make sure the matter was concluded." Her eyes grew distant. "Tell me, Inspector, did the Reverend see the body before you arrived?" "He claims not," says she confessed while he prayed beside her. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. Men who pray too quickly often do so to drown out another sound. She walked past him toward the lane. "Come, I think the garden at the vicarage has one more secret to give." They found the Reverend at the back of the house, turning soil with a spade. The boy knelt beside him, planting bulbs. When he saw the inspector, he stiffened but kept digging. Miss Marple's eyes swept the ground. Neat rows, orderly, too recent. "Such lovely work," she said pleasantly. "I don't recall this bed being here before." "It's new," the Reverend replied, wiping his brow. "Something to keep the lad busy." Cray glanced at the spade. The edge gleamed, flattened and slightly dented. "Mind if I have a look?" he asked. The clergyman hesitated, then handed it over. The metal bore a faint reddish stain along the joint. Cray met Miss Marple's gaze. She gave a single, sad nod. The Reverend's voice broke the silence. "She told me what she'd done. I went to her. He was still breathing, barely. She begged me to help him, but he looked at me and smiled as if mocking. He said the boy would grow to look just like him. And he faltered, staring at the earth. I struck again. I wanted it ended. For her, for the parish, for God's order." The boy rose slowly, dirt falling from his hands. "You killed my father," he said. The words were quiet, stripped of rage, but the sound of them was unbearable. The Reverend turned toward him, his face hollow. "I raise no hand against you, James. I meant only to spare you shame." Miss Marple stepped forward, placing herself between them. "There has been enough shame," she said softly. Her voice carried no judgment, only weariness. "Confession is not salvation, Reverend, but it is a start. The boy has lost one parent already. Do not take from him the last small piece of goodness you might yet give." Cray moved closer, his tone formal now. "You'll come with me to Melchester, sir?" The Reverend bowed his head. "God forgive me," he whispered. Then, to the boy, "You must learn mercy, James. The world has none to spare." He laid the spade down gently beside the rosebed and walked toward the gate without looking back. When they were gone, the garden seemed to exhale. The late sun caught the tips of the lilies, turning them pale gold. Miss Marple touched the boy's shoulder. "He was not all wicked," she said, "only afraid. Fear makes strangers of even the kindest hearts." The child looked up at her. "Will they send me away again?" "No," she said, "not this time. He frowned. "Then where will I go?" She smiled, faint but warm. "There's a spare room at my cottage, and I dare say I could use a hand with the roses." He nodded, too tired to speak. They walked back along the lane together, their shadows stretching long in the evening light. Behind them, the church bells began to toll again, soft, hesitant, as though unsure whether to mourn or to bless. That night, Miss Marple sat by her window as the boy slept in the next room. The village lay silent under a thin mist, the vicarage barely visible beyond the hedge. In her lap lay the final letter from Mrs. Pottle, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. The truth was never meant to live this long. She looked out toward the faint silhouette of the church tower and whispered, "No, my dear." But it lived long enough to be seen. The clock struck midnight. Somewhere beyond the fields, an owl cried once and was still. Miss Marple folded the letter and slipped it into her knitting basket, beside a pair of half-finished socks. Life, she thought, was much like knitting a series of mistakes corrected, a pattern that only made sense when seen whole. And as she rose to draw the curtains, she felt a quiet peace settle over her heart, not triumph, not sorrow, but the fragile comfort of knowing that even in the smallest of places, truth, once uncovered, had a way of lighting its own candle in the dark. The next morning dawned grey and windless, the kind of morning that seemed unwilling to begin at all. A fine drizzle clung to the hedgerows, and the mist hung over Street Mildred's like a veil, softening every outline. Miss Marple rose early, not from habit this time, but from the uneasy sense that something in the story had not quite closed. The Reverend's confession had satisfied the law, but not her intuition. Truth, she knew, was rarely a single event. It unfolded, like morning fog, revealing its edges only when one had the patience to stand still and wait. She brewed her tea and glanced at the small figure asleep on her sofa. The boy James had shifted restlessly through the night, murmuring things she couldn't quite hear. In the grey half-light, he looked neither child nor adult, simply lost somewhere between one world and the next. Miss Marple smiled faintly, brushed a crumb from his collar, and thought of the words the Reverend had spoken the evening before. "You must learn mercy, James." There was mercy to learn yet, but also something more elusive, the truth that still trembled in the air, half-buried and patient. By mid-morning, Inspector Cray came walking up the lane. He had the look of a man who carried both fatigue and reluctant respect. "He's gone quiet," he said, stepping into her kitchen. "The Reverend's in Melchester Gaol." Confessed again to the magistrate. "Plain as you please. He won't contest it." Miss Marple poured him tea without replying. After a moment, she said, "And the boy's father?" Cray blinked. "You mean Talbot?" "Yes," she said softly. "You've buried him in the churchyard, I assume?" He nodded. "Yesterday afternoon. Small service, just the gravedigger and myself. The coroner allowed it. Mrs. Bantry's still telling people she saw lightning strike the spire at the same moment, but I assure you, it was only the sun." Miss Marple gave a faint smile, but her eyes remained distant. Strange, though. The boy never once called him father. Even when he spoke of him, it was always the man. Children are honest by nature, even when they don't mean to be. "Tell me, Inspector, did the Reverend ever see Talbot before that day?" Cray frowned, thinking. "Not that we can prove. He claimed the man wrote to his wife but never met him in person until the day of the fete. And yet," Miss Marple said, setting down her cup, "he described Talbot's smile in rather precise detail." Cray looked up sharply. "You think he knew him already?" "I think," she said quietly, "that this tragedy began long before that afternoon." She stood and went to the window, gazing at the path that led to the churchyard. If the Reverend truly struck in mercy, then what did mercy look like to him? Perhaps not protection at all, but recognition. That afternoon, Miss Marple went to the vicarage alone. It was silent now, smelling faintly of dust and lavender polish. In the study, books were stacked neatly, as though waiting for a return that would never come. She trailed her fingers along the spines, pausing at a slim, leather-bound volume tucked behind the prayer manuals. It was a hymnal, unmarked, except for a name written faintly on the inside cover. Henry Pottle. Her breath caught. She turned the pages, and between the leaves found an old photograph. Two young men in clerical coats, their arms around each other's shoulders. One was unmistakably the Reverend Pottle, the other, younger, sharper, with the same light eyes as the boy. Beneath the photo, written in faded ink, were the words, Melchester Theological Seminary, 1909. When she returned home, Inspector Cray was waiting by her gate, impatient. "You've found something," he said, seeing the expression on her face. She handed him the photograph. They were brothers, Inspector, the Reverend and Mr. Talbot. Half-brothers, I should say. Same father, different mothers. It explains the likeness, the boy's features, the Reverend's despair. When Talbot appeared, it wasn't only scandal he brought, it was the ghost of the family's own sin. Cray turned the photo in his hand, his brow furrowed. Good Lord. So he killed his brother? No, Miss Marple said softly. He killed the mirror that showed him himself. That's the tragedy of it. I think Mrs. Pottle never knew. Talbot must have come not to claim the child, but to force acknowledgement to be seen, perhaps even forgiven. He must have told the Reverend who he was in that last argument, and the Reverend, unable to bear it, struck him down. Cray let out a long breath. We'll never prove it now. Nor should we, she replied gently. The truth has done enough harm for one village. They stood in silence, listening to the wind move through the hedges. Then Cray said, What will you tell the boy? Nothing, Miss Marple said. Not yet. Children deserve to build their innocence before the world teaches them how easily it shatters. He'll know, one day, when it can no longer wound him. That evening, as the rain began again, Miss Marple found James in the garden, kneeling by the rose bed where he had once planted bulbs with the Reverend. He was staring at the soil as though expecting something to rise from it. Will he come back? He asked suddenly. Miss Marple shook her head. No, dear. He's gone where all weary souls go, but he left you something better than his return. What's that? The chance to begin again, she said softly. He looked up at her, uncertain but listening. She knelt beside him and placed her gloved hand over his. The roses will bloom soon. You'll see. Every spring brings them back, no matter how harsh the winter has been. That's what people forget about gardens they remember. He nodded slowly, and for the first time, a faint, hesitant smile touched his face. When night fell, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the hymnal open in her lap. The photograph lay beside her, edges curling slightly in the heat. She thought of the Reverend's last words, of Mrs. Pottle's letter, of the boy's unspoken grief. Somewhere among those tangled threads was not just sorrow, but release the quiet kind that grows when truth is no longer hunted, only accepted. The clock ticked gently, steady and calm. Outside, the church bells rang once, a single note drifting through the rain. Miss Marple closed the hymnal, her eyes soft with thought. Street. Mildred's would heal, as it always did, quietly, beneath the watchful patience of time. And in the little cottage by the lane, where the fire glowed warm and steady, the boy who had once carried no name slept peacefully at last, while Miss Marple, with her knitting in her lap and the weight of truth behind her, watched the flames flicker and fade into the long, forgiving night. The days that followed were soft and strangely quiet, as if the whole village were exhaling after a long-held breath. The scandal of the vicarage had begun to dissolve into rumor, reshaped into something more bearable by the comforting touch of distance. Mrs. Bantry had already started saying it was more of a family misunderstanding than a true crime, and the postmistress agreed, though she added that one could never be too sure about people who looked overly saintly. Miss Marple, who heard all of this while buying sugar one morning, smiled faintly but said nothing. She knew the way truth aged in street. Mildred's it mellowed, like sherry left uncorked, losing its sharpness until it could be swallowed easily. At home, she found the boy in the garden again, kneeling beside the rosebed. The weather had turned kinder. The air was damp but mild, and the buds were beginning to show color. He had been quiet since the day of the Reverend's confession, though there was a new steadiness in his gaze, as if the world had grown both smaller and clearer. When she called to him, he looked up with a slight smile. "They said, 'The Reverend's gone away,'" he said. "Far away." Miss Marple nodded. "He has, for reflection. Will he come back?" "Perhaps," she said. "But if he doesn't, it will be because he's finally found peace." She hesitated. "You remember what I told you, that sometimes people go where they can no longer harm anyone, even by accident. That's what he's done. He meant no cruelty, my dear, only weakness." The boy seemed to accept that, in the way children sometimes accept the impossible when it's spoken softly enough. He went back to his planting, small fingers pressing the soil. Miss Marple watched him for a while, thinking of how time itself was like the earth beneath his hands, capable of burying what was ugly and coaxing something new to bloom from it. Yet the faint unease she had felt in recent days still lingered, not about guilt now, nor punishment, but about silence. Too many letters had been found, and yet perhaps one more remained unfound. That evening, after supper, she lit her lamp and drew the curtains against the mist that had crept in from the fields. The house was warm and still. The only sound, the rhythmic click of her knitting needles. The boy had fallen asleep on the sofa again, a book open beside him, an old collection of parables she had once read to a Sunday school class. One page was marked with a small brass paperclip, likely borrowed from her writing desk. Miss Marple leaned forward to remove it and paused. The clip was bent oddly, its end twisted into a tiny spiral, as though it had once held something thicker than paper. She looked at the book again. Between 2 pages near the back, faint impressions were pressed into the paper letters, as if written atop it long ago. She tilted the lamp. The indents formed words, uneven but legible. "He knows. Take the hymnal." Her pulse quickened, though her expression remained serene. The hymnal, the one she had already found at the vicarage, but the message suggested a different writer. Not the Reverend, not his wife. Someone warning them both. She thought again of the half-brother, Henry Talbot, the man who had come not for vengeance but for acknowledgement. Perhaps he, too, had been afraid. Perhaps he had not come alone. The next morning, she went to the church. It was empty, still smelling faintly of wax and dust. The sexton, Mr. Harper, was oiling the hinges on the vestry door when she arrived. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said cheerfully. "Back to your investigations, are you?" "Just a small matter of curiosity," she replied. "Tell me, Mr. Harper, on the day of the fete, did anyone else have reason to be near the vestry before the commotion?" He scratched his chin. "Well now, come to think, there was one fellow, stranger, came asking about the Reverend before noon, said he had a parcel to deliver from Melchester. Describe him. Tall, dark coat, hat pulled low. Didn't give his name. Left the parcel by the church door when I told him the Reverend was busy." "What became of it?" Harper frowned. "Odd thing. When I went back later, it was gone." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Yes," she said, "I rather thought it might be." She thanked him and walked home, her mind turning over the possibilities. A parcel from Melchester, a stranger who vanished, a message written in haste and hidden inside a hymnal. It fit together in a curious way, not as a new crime, but as the echo of one. Perhaps someone had sent the Reverend proof of his brother's existence, birth papers, family letters, a certificate long buried. Talbot had not come uninvited. He had been summoned, unknowingly, by the very man who would kill him. Truth had a way of calling itself home, even when unwelcomed. That evening, as she prepared tea, Inspector Cray arrived once more, his boots muddy, his face tired but not unfriendly. "You never rest, do you?" he said, setting his hat on the table. "Rest is a reward," she replied. "One should earn it first." She told him what Harper had said, showed him the impressions in the book, the bent paperclip, and her deductions. He listened quietly, stirring his tea with a frown. "So the Reverend sent for his brother without knowing it," he said at last. And when the man arrived, the old shame rose up in him again. "Guilt often writes the letters that confession cannot," she murmured. Cray exhaled. "I'll make a note for the record. But between us, Miss Marple, I think it's best left buried." "Most things are," she said, "but sometimes one must know the soil's history before one plants in it again." They shared a silence that was almost companionable. When he left, the light had faded entirely. Miss Marple stood by the window, watching him disappear down the lane. The mist was heavier now, but through it she could see the faint glow of the church lantern burning steady as ever. She turned back to the sofa, where the boy slept again, a faint smile on his lips. The lamp's glow softened his features. For the first time, he looked entirely at peace. Miss Marple folded her knitting and placed it on the table. Outside, the rain began to fall again, gentle and unthreatening, washing the last traces of the past from the earth. And so the quiet returned to street Mildred's, not as denial, but as mercy, the kind of peace that came not from forgetting, but from remembering everything, and choosing to forgive it anyway. Miss Marple poured herself one last cup of tea, the clock ticking steadily behind her, and let the warmth of it settle in her hands like the ending of a long, sorrowful prayer. The next morning came with a strange brightness, the kind that makes even sorrow seem briefly suspended. Sunlight filtered through thin mist, striking the church bell and casting a pale shimmer across the rooftops of street Mildred's. Miss Marple sat at her table with her breakfast tray untouched, her mind restless despite the calm. The mysteries of the case had unraveled themselves one after another, and yet she felt the weight of something unspoken still hanging between her and the truth. Perhaps it was the boy's silence, his curious refusal to ask more, his acceptance too complete for a child his age. He had seen too much to be curious, and that, she thought, was the worst tragedy of all. When the boy woke, she found him standing at the window, looking out toward the road that led to Melchester. "Do they have gardens there?" he asked suddenly. "In the place where he's gone?" Miss Marple followed his gaze, then answered gently, "Mildred's on a quiet morning." He nodded faintly, his reflection small against the glass. "Then maybe he won't be lonely." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Inspector Cray again, but this time he looked oddly hesitant. "I thought I'd call, Miss Marple," he said, a small matter more tidying up than anything. She ushered him in with her usual calm courtesy, though she caught the strain in his voice. He set a small brown envelope on the table. "Came in this morning's post. Addressed to you." She frowned. "To me?" "Yes," he said. "Posted from Melchester yesterday evening, before the Reverend was taken north." She opened it slowly. Inside was a folded page, written in a hand she recognized at once. The Reverend's, even and careful, like his sermons. "Dear Miss Marple," it began. "You once said, 'Confession is not salvation, only the beginning of it.' You were right. There was more I could not say, then not out of deceit, but because I feared I might lose what little courage remained to me. My brother's death was no accident, nor entirely my sin. The blow I struck ended him. Yes, but it was the second. When I came upon him, he was already bleeding, gasping, calling a name I did not understand. He said only, 'Tell her, the boy is not mine.' I thought he meant my wife, but I believe now he meant someone else." Miss Marple read the lines twice before speaking. "He says her, not his wife. That distinction never happens by mistake." Cray nodded grimly. "The postmaster confirmed the Reverend gave the letter himself last night. Seems he couldn't carry the burden anymore. But what in heaven's name does it mean?" She tapped the letter gently. "It means," she said, "that there was another woman. Not Mrs. Pottle, and not from here." Her mind turned over each detail. The parcel from Melchester, the stranger who left it, the boy who appeared at the fete with no name, and that first moment she saw him, his clothes too fine for a vagrant, too worn for a child of comfort. "He wasn't sent here by chance," she murmured. "He was delivered." Quite literally. By afternoon, she had taken Cray to the rectory archive, a cramped room at the back of the church where dust lay thick on the ledgers. The air smelled of old ink and candle soot. "Every child christened in this parish has their name recorded here," she said, "even those who were not meant to be remembered." They searched in silence until, near the back, she found an entry dated 15 years earlier. James Henry Talbot. It read, "Mother, M. Talbot. Deceased. Father, Henry Talbot. Witnessed by Reverend Pottle." Cray straightened, his eyes narrowing. "So the Reverend knew from the beginning?" "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "He baptized the child himself. Only he later buried the record among the dead, where no one would look." But who was M. Talbot? She turned the page and found the answer in faded pencil notes written at the bottom. "Miriam Talbot, formerly of Melchester Orphanage, deceased in childbirth." Miss Marple sighed softly. So the boy's mother was never Mrs. Pottle. She was the Reverend's own ward, an orphan he once sponsored through the parish. And Henry Talbot, the brother, must have married her later, perhaps out of gratitude, perhaps out of love. It explains why he returned. The boy was his, not the Reverend's. Yet to the Reverend, he must have felt like a ghost of what he'd lost. Cray let out a low breath. He struck down his brother, thinking to silence his past, and all the while he'd been punishing himself for another man's child. Miss Marple folded the register gently. "Tragedies often begin not with cruelty, Inspector, but with shame. It's a slower poison, and harder to see." That evening, as she walked home with the boy by her side, the mist returned, soft and low. He carried a small paper packet of seeds, roses, he'd insisted on buying with his own coins from the grocer. He liked roses, the boy said quietly, meaning the Reverend. "Plant them for him." "Yes," Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. "And for the others too." They worked until dusk, planting in silence. When the last seed was covered, the boy looked up at her and asked, "Will it hurt to remember?" "Sometimes," she said, "but forgetting hurts more." That night, when she sat again by her fire, Miss Marple read the Reverend's letter one last time before slipping it into the hymnal beside the photograph of the two brothers. She left it there, neither hidden nor displayed, only placed where truth might rest in peace. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the sound of the clock filled the little cottage with its steady, patient rhythm. The investigation had ended, yes, but not the story. For in Street, Mildred's stories never ended completely. They merely learned to speak more quietly, in the spaces between the bells and the silence after prayer. Miss Marple closed her eyes, the warmth of the fire soft on her face, and thought of the boy asleep in the next room, of the roses waiting for spring, and of all the names that had finally found their place. The mystery, at last, had done what all mysteries must, not merely reveal the guilty, but give the living a way to go on. The final days of that quiet winter passed gently, like the closing pages of a well-read book. The fog lifted early now, and sunlight returned to the lanes of Street. Mildred's, glinting on the dew-wet hedges and the little brass cross on the church roof. The roses that Miss Marple and the boy had planted were already showing the faint green promise of new growth, their stems stubborn against the cold. Life, as it always did in the village, had chosen to go on. Yet, for Miss Marple, the case did not truly end until she visited the churchyard one last time. She came alone, carrying a small bunch of wildflowers from her own garden, simple things, rosemary for remembrance and white hellebore for mercy. The grave of Henry Talbot lay beneath the old yew, modest and freshly turned. The vicarage plot beside it was still empty. It would remain so for now, she hoped, until spring softened the earth again. She placed the flowers there and stood quietly, thinking of the tangled web that had bound those lives together. Love, guilt, secrecy, and the quiet ache of wanting to belong. Behind her, footsteps approached, steady and familiar. "I thought I might find you here," Inspector Cray said. His tone held no formality today, only understanding. "The papers are closing the file," he went on. "The Reverend's been transferred to the diocesan hospice in the north. He's not expected to live out the season." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze still on the grave. "I imagine he'll find that a kind of peace. Dying among prayers is better than living among whispers." Cray studied her for a moment. "You knew it all before any of us, didn't you?" "I suspected," she said mildly. "Knowing and proving are such different things. But there was always something about that boy's eyes, too, like the Reverend's for mere coincidence, too unlike him for paternity. It's a dreadful puzzle, Inspector, when resemblance tells two stories at once." He gave a small, rueful smile. "You have a gift for making tragedy sound almost graceful." "Oh no," she said softly. "Tragedy is never graceful. It only becomes bearable when one looks at it kindly." She turned from the grave and walked with him toward the gate. "Will you stay for tea?" "The boy baked scones this morning. A little uneven, but very proud of them." Cray hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." They walked back along the lane where the hedges brushed their sleeves. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the green, where life had resumed its ordinary mischief. Miss Marple listened with a small smile, comforted by the sound. The village had already begun its gentle work of forgetting. Only the church bells would remember, and even they, she thought, would soften their tone with time. At the cottage, the boy greeted them shyly, flower still on his sleeves. Miss Marple set the table while Cray poured the tea. The conversation drifted to harmless things, the weather, the coming fete, Mrs. Bantry's persistent campaign to introduce modern hymnals. But beneath it all ran a quiet current of understanding, that what they had shared in silence had changed them both. When Cray left at dusk, he paused at the gate. "You'll keep him then?" "For a while," she said, "until he learns what peace sounds like. Children should grow among gentle things before the world teaches them noise." He tipped his hat. "You're a rare soul, Miss Marple." "Not at all," she replied. "Only an old woman who's learned that kindness is the only cleverness worth having." When the cottage was quiet again, she sat by the fire, the boy curled up in the chair opposite, fast asleep with a book open across his knees. The last embers glowed faintly, their light flickering across her knitting basket where, tucked between the yarn, lay the Reverend's final letter and the photograph of the two brothers. She took them out once more, not to read but simply to hold, as one might hold a memory that has stopped hurting. Outside, the wind stirred the rosebed, carrying with it the faint, sweet scent of new buds breaking through the cold soil. Miss Marple listened to the sound and felt the smallest smile touch her lips. There were no more questions to ask, no more truths to unearth. The village would heal in its own quiet way, and the boy, her boy, now would grow up, knowing that love, once broken, could still be mended in gentler hands. She rose, placed another log on the fire, and stood for a long moment at the window, watching the light spread across the fields. The mist had lifted entirely. The church bell rang once, clear and untroubled, echoing down the lane. It sounded not like mourning now, but like forgiveness. Miss Marple drew the curtains, returned to her chair, and picked up her knitting once more. Her needles clicked softly in the warm glow as the clock ticked its steady rhythm, a small, familiar heartbeat against the vast quiet of the night. And in that peace, the mystery of street Mildred's came finally to rest. The end.